Hi everyone, welcome to Docu's Space episode 5. I'll be your host, Robbie.
And I'm your host, Joseph. Today's episode is value money or money value, our fifth episode. Hopefully, you guys remember these recurring guests. So yeah, we'll get right into it. So we're going to talk about money, and I guess in architecture specifically, too, people are very scared about talking about money. I know my boss do. Anytime we have financial issues, he's like, "Yeah, I want to change this idea that we can't talk about money and pay and things like that." But even he still admits that he has a hard time doing it. And I think my opinion on that is that I think intrinsically the arts are seen as like a soulful or spiritual thing, right? Like you're supposed to follow and pursue art for the pursuit of it. And the idea presented in like movies and shows and things like that. I'm not sure if you guys have a similar perception on that.
Well, um, I think people should still go around and say their names just in case the audience don't remember them. But adding to that, I do think that generally in the creative fields, we are underpaid. Coming from the background of an architect, we also know that architecture in itself is a profession that is kind of catered towards a certain class. Like you will only get a house built if you are in a certain if you're rich, essentially. Why am I shying away from saying that? Um, and then that essentially makes kind of the profession in itself a bit gated. And conversely, then as architects, what we're getting paid when we're working for people is also less. So I think that could also be a part of today's conversation. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. Does anyone else have anything to add?
Uh, as a quick introduction, I'm Jack. I'm an architect living and working in London. So yeah, I agree with that position. And it kind of it comes through to who is educated in architecture as well. It's seemingly that kind of an only a career open to people from affluent backgrounds. But obviously there's a lot of work being done to open the doors to that. And I don't know, I expect more diversity from different backgrounds would probably help the financial situation for people working in the industry. And as people with different financial backgrounds trickle through into like more decision-making positions, that could potentially help the situation. But that certainly doesn't have that's not how it feels at the moment.
Yeah, very true. I think especially coming from maybe a less affluent background too, even in education, especially when I first started, it was very jarring to like be doing architecture and then also not having the same like financial capabilities. And I remember like there's sometimes in studio where I was like, okay, I'm not gonna be able to afford making that model. Like that is impossible. Conceptually, that's cool, but I cannot afford that. And then having to like not really feeling comfortable to broach the topic because it was just assumed that that's something you can do. Um, and I remember first semester of school, I was using only wood, and everybody said, "Oh, you're so good at wood." You're like, I'm gonna ask you questions about bandsaw. I'm like, yeah, it's not elective. And before the wood guy, I was the string guy for like a week because that's what I could afford doing. Um, yeah, and I think that definitely does create a different starting point for certain people, but definitely like as you know, you move on, the skills do translate into other things. So you do become good at like managing that. Um, yeah, and I think that's like an extra layer that at least like I felt a little bit, and maybe Ruby might have felt that too.
I did. We had when we were talking about this episode, Joseph and I were like, "Oh, we don't want it to sound like we're whining too much." Oh, we were whining too much, and we might whine too much.
Valid is a valid one.
Because
My
it
Just
just
playing the little violin.
it's like, oh, my pain. But essentially, it just felt unfair. That it just felt like people who were not earning money just so they can survive realistically had more time on their hands. And when they had more time on their hands, they had more time to put in the models that they're making, or they had more time to do an extracurricular activity or like do another social thing. And that was time Joseph and I were like spending doing a job so we could support ourselves, so we could support our family. And, sometimes that did take away from a college experience or like, you know, like maybe I wasn't able to finish a model as much as I wanted to just because of that constraint, which is a very realistic one for a lot of people. And yeah, I don't know what the experience was with you guys in terms of just financial constraints or certain privileges you felt you had, and if you wanted to talk
or
about
didn't
that.
have.
Yeah, but that was just our experience. It's kind of something we bonded over. I was like, who else is broke who I can talk to? Oh, Joseph, hi.
Oh, yeah.
I'll jump in here. I'm Imeng. I'm a urban designer to be, still in New York City.
And a recent graduate, by the way.
Recent grad
Amazing.
of another expensive degree of 2 years. So I must acknowledge that I come from a background that I don't have to worry too much about the finance. Not to say that, you know, I can
Right, yeah.
afford a $200 steel model, but I'm very lucky that my parents are able to afford offload a lot of this pressure from me. But I must say, one thing that I've been thinking in for the education of architecture and the industry of architecture is that we're such a asset heavy industry that, like Joseph and Robbie said, like we need to make models that cost like $500 a semester or something, versus if you study, say, economics or math, maybe you're spending more is on, you know, papers or this is not accurate, but like we're a very asset heavy industry in general. Like if you think about building a building, it costs 3 years, a house, 3 years, 5 workers, construction workers, numerous materials go into it. And that in the time of current logistics cost a lot of money. Versus I've been very intrigued recently about the whole tech business model. Like,
Yeah.
how do they do it? They just have a laptop, run a bunch of code. Like, how does Uber become Uber? You know, like, it's just bizarre. Like, what's this revenue model? I think one thing is that, you know, architecture has been like traditional industry, like it's very asset heavy. Like, is there anything that we can sort of learn from some asset light management or business model that, you know, save us all some crap? So one thing I'm not urging us to go back to COVID time, but like Zoom does give some benefit in terms of like, okay, now you only need one software, which is Rhino. You don't necessarily have to compete, which not Rhino, hopefully like the school provides. You don't have to compete with like other materials that you're not having access to.
Yeah. I think to your point though, there is actually a ton of money in architecture, right? Like it's a huge industry, like you're saying. You already alluded to that, like how much it takes to actually build something. Right?
Especially real estate investment in
Yeah,
America, it's not
developers,
going
all
away.
that. Yeah. But the thing is, like, and having seen a bit of our work contracts, like the slice of the pie that the architect actually gets in that huge sum is just so small. Like it doesn't compare to what the developer is going to make, or the contractor, right? It's that like balance of like, okay, who actually has access to that industry? And because the architect is actually getting a very, I think, in my opinion, a very small part of that portion, then it trickles down to like what employees are making, right? And revenue and overhead and all that type of stuff. So that's at least like I think a bit of the problem is not necessarily that architecture is not lucrative, it's not lucrative for architects somehow.
Yeah, I don't know about what everyone's like heard of, but what I heard of is like architect's fee is usually 5% of the total.
So that's pretty accurate
costs.
actually. Yeah.
I mean, the hard cost means the material, the wood and the concrete that goes into the construction, about like more than 50%. And then the soft cost, which is the cost of that's not material, is less than 50%, and then architect only take up a small portion of it.
Yeah.
So
before we go further, I want to introduce myself briefly.
I made a mess
as well. My name is Bano. I went to Cornell where I met Rabi and Joseph. Then I switched to the AA, and I'm about to finish masters, and I'm located in London. Between bachelor's and masters, I had 1 year work experience as well. from which I hope to contribute. On my side, I could say that the year I worked on an infrastructure project commissioned by the government. So the budget was very, very high. The deadlines were like as flexible as it could be. And it was like a black hole, just like money flowing in to contractors, engineers, less to architects, like Iman mentioned. But in terms of employees, I was getting 1/5 of the money that was being charged to the client, which is a very small ratio.
Right.
And having talked to people who employed before, like who ran architecture offices before in the previous decades, they told me it would be 1/3 or 1/4 normally. And now I have a friend who still works in the same office, and his salary is 1/7 of what is being charged to the client. Of course, I haven't been an employer before, so I'm sure there are like insurances, expenses, laptop rents, a lot of expenses that goes into one employee for that employee to be able to work in that office, but still the difference is massive.
Yeah.
And it becomes a more profitable business for the employer rather than the employee that does the job.
Yeah, for sure.
You'd expect a business, well, maybe it's more reflective of a small business than a large business, but 70% of the business's costs should be salaries. So, but I think the sort of the bigger the company, then the maybe smaller proportion that becomes, but as other overheads and I guess profit as well. So the slice of the cake that the partners or directors are taking also increases with that sort of size proportion.
At the moment, what is happening to my ex-colleague in the office is that a large portion of his salary that is kept in the office is now being spent on other employees who are working on competitions who might that might not generate revenue at the end.
Well, this is wild to me, honestly.
No,
we had a professor that did
horrible.
competitions exclusively for his firm, and I was like, no wonder you're still a professor. There's no way you could support yourself that way. And he mentioned that he was like, there are moments where we just have droughts and we literally can't hire anybody, and only him and his partner would run the firm for months on end until they get a job, and then they hire someone temporarily to do it, you know. But yeah, that's definitely changes the dynamic of how your firm works.
Yeah, there's some like competitions our firm was working on for barely any money, literally, and we were losing more than we were earning, and that puts us back by a lot. And I mean, I feel very weirdly about competition culture, but I also know it's very architecture thing to do, but it's not a money maker. It's not anybody.
No. Only 1/10 of, like, you only have 10% chance to win, and when you win, you have another 10% for the project to continue and being built, because the client might give up. There might not be enough budget. The competition might get cancelled or disqualified and stuff like that. So it's 10% of 10% where you might start actually making money. But I think it starts in school, because in school we don't get taught for money. Like Joseph mentioned, like a lot of people, they struggle like to get materials to make the models. You probably remember how much rockite cost in Cornell in such small amounts, and you would cast and you would think like it's gonna be this thing, and then you realize you need to buy 3 more bags to actually fill that volume and stuff,
and then it leaks.
And it leaks. And it leaks onto
it's
your
war
steel.
flashbacks for us.
You have to buy all of that again. But if they had taught us, like, not that maybe you can still afford it, but even if you can afford it, just consider how much this model is gonna cost, right?
Yeah.
If they had taught us that this model making and learning architecture is not just passion with no financial considerations. If they had taught that in school, then once we go on to jobs, we would be passionate and financially considerate. about what we're doing. But with our time, with our money, we weren't really thought to be considerate. Like, it would almost be romanticized more if you had spent 10 hours on a model rather than 3. So the whole culture continues. So if you have to get promoted, or if you want to get promoted, or if you want a raise, or if you want to show how passionate you are about the job, then you work overtime.
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think sorry, go ahead, Jack.
I was
I'm
gonna say
just saying, oh,
everyone's had an opportunity to, like, we've all kind of come back to this like model making during a uni experience, and I remember it was like it was a moment for me in undergrad when I decided it was time to stop. Like, my situation was my parents obviously were able to support me through a lot of my education, but they were also very keen on me, like, if I wanted to live a certain way, I should have a part-time job. So I think I worked at a supermarket for most of my undergrad, but the moment that I kind of decided that it was time to like quit that job was the sort of building up to the final model that was going to go into the end of year exhibition. So that was when I begrievedly like left my job at the supermarket to spend a horrendous amount of hours on like the sort of final model for that exhibition. And yeah, I can see what you mean by saying like that kind of that culture and trying to like do something really well flows into your career. And I think the overarching thing, the theme that's coming through in the last few sort of things that have been said have been that we're too open to giving something away for free.
For sure, yeah.
Whether it's like competitions before we've even got the work, but also when we start the project or we've confirmed the project, we're still like, as I think as a profession, willing to do the bit that we like doing, whether it's the model making or it's the concept design. We're still willing to do that bit for free, or for like a reduced fee, or for a favor for the client, or a quick feasibility study. The something that what differentiates us from kind of like non-creative fields, I think, is that the bit that we like, we're so attached to that we're willing to compromise on the money side for it.
For sure, yeah.
Yeah.
I think you said something that's really important, is that we do things for free in the office. Like, I don't know that many professions that do that, especially the quantity and the time of which we do it for. And I think that big firms typically are able to do that easier. Like my firm being as small as we are, we can't do that. Like, we can't spend time not making money, but we end up doing that anyways, right? But we're not gonna like start a project where we don't make money and we don't even know if the project's gonna continue, right? And I think that devalues the field a little bit, right? It's like you're competing with people that can do it for free. And if you can't do it for free, then they'll go somewhere else. So then you kind of have to like fall in line to make it work sometimes.
This is just very multi-layered, the whole argument about money, I feel. My project manager always says that don't be afraid to ask about money. We usually do work for developers and they do have a lot of money, and all they need to do is sell one unit in their 230, unit building, and that's the design fee. But then people still end up saying that
That
this
is so true.
yeah, and then
That's
people
so true.
still end up saying that, oh, this firm is so expensive. I'm like, how? And then
One unit that's mind blowing.
literally just
Good
one
grief.
unit, which we
Yeah.
can't even afford, by the way.
So funny, shoot.
And then when we do get that fee, there's a kind of like a mismatch between where the money is going within the firm in itself, how it trickles down to you. It becomes really less. And then also the argument about how much worth you then attach to what you're doing, even when you're making less money, because you are, at the end of the day, in a field that you feel passionately about. So you're okay with spending, like, let's say 20 hours on something and just getting paid for 9 hours. And this is such a broken system, you guys.
Yeah, it's crazy to think even how do we start to combat that culture a little bit? Like, it seems so ingrained in what the client is expecting, even that, like, I think as a firm, and this is something I think about all the time, but like, what do I want to do in my career? It's like, do I want to stay working at a big firm and just work up the corporate ladder and maybe not even enjoy what I do that much, right? Do I want the money to become my value, or do I want to just like, you know, work at a firm that I truly believe in and not worry about like my finances, right? How much I'm going to get paid, and just, you know, pursue the dream, right? Because there are, you know, I think we all have aspirations in what we want to do in our career, but then it's like, do you want to pursue that, or do you want to like just go into money? And I feel like in the arts in general, that's always something that people have to deal with. Remember, as a kid, my parents would be like, don't do art. Like we're not well off. That's not an option we're gonna afford you. And not that I ever wanted to, but like it definitely becomes a real thing, right? It's like, do your passions outweigh your ability to live your livelihood, right? And I think unfortunately we're asked to make that decision a lot in architecture as well. And people don't realize that. Like my parents were cool with architecture because they're like, oh, that sounds like it makes a lot of money. And I was like, well, I want to do it, so I'm not going to correct you. So that's kind of how I ended up here in the first place.
Oh, me too. I told my parents that I was doing architectural engineering, and because I attached the word engineering to it, although that's not true at all, they were suddenly okay with it. Well, but now they know. It's so interesting because my dad recently visited me, and I have this painting on my wall at the back. You will not see a zoomed version of it, just looks pretty from afar. And he's like, "Oh, you painted that? You know how to paint?" And I was like, "Dad, I was doing that throughout high school. I had like huge canvas. How can you just remove that from your memory?" But then I remember like every single time I would show that I was passionate about like painting, he would just kind of steer away from the conversation. And now that I'm an adult who's making money and like a satisfactory amount of money according to him, and this is not me sounding like mean. I don't like, I love my dad, y'all know that, but but now that he sees me as like an adult who's making my own money and I'm okay financially, he's suddenly okay and loves that I'm painting, you know. And
Yeah, and quickly, it's a meme in our culture too, right? Like, how I feel like you guys have all seen that meme where it's like, "Oh, I finished college with a degree, I don't have a job," and the comments would be like, "I bet it's an arts degree," or like it's a right. There's an idea that there is a class of work or field that just isn't valuable, right? And people think that, think, "Oh, an art degree, you're gonna starve." Like that's I think a joke I've seen like in 20 different iterations, right? And I think that's part of the problem too, is like we all expect that to be the case, but we don't ask ourselves like, is that really the value of the arts? Because I think given how the arts work, right, it's very hard to define. I think like if you're doing engineering or if you're in medicine, those things are a lot easier for people to understand just because they interact with it more. Like I know the worth of my arm to me. So a doctor, I'm like, yeah, of course you should get paid that much. You're gonna save my life or something, right? But we don't attach the same value to architecture or design or the arts in general, because I don't think we have to actively engage in the value it actually has to our lives, right? We think it's very trivial, or it's very elective, or it's very entertainment, but entertainment and culture is so big to how humans actually operate that like there's so many industries that are fully based on that, right? I think sometimes you take for granted how much those things actually add enrichment to our lives, right? It's not necessarily about food, water, shelter, right? There are things that do bring joy to us, and joy does have value. And I think people sometimes kind of just overwrite that a little bit.
I agree.
Yeah. And when it's like, I don't know, a big infrastructure project, the requirement for it to be functional as well as enjoyable often takes like precedent. And I mean that's one, a big infrastructure project is one example, but equally a developer trying to deliver 250 homes is often more tied in, like more interested in the functionality and the making the metrics meet, making the financial model meet, which plays more into maybe other consultants' roles like the cost consultant or quantity surveyor, and doesn't put as much associate as much value with the architect's role, even though the architect is the primary person driving it through something, maybe the planning permissions that it needs to go ahead in the first place. But yeah, I think the sort of drive towards very functional kind of I don't know, maybe minimalist architecture that's costs as little as possible, but delivers a product, takes away something from the value associated with architecture, the profession that we were all kind of sold as being an artist, but with a salary that's a bit more assured. Yeah.
for sure.
I mean, you go, Imang.
This sort of ties into the question of who should pay. You know, we're talking about the developer developing a 250 unit, which is maybe the main source of our income most of the time, but oftentimes the planning demands that, okay, the ground floor must be open. It's a public space whatsoever. So like, who pays for this public space? Like, I guess it varies, depends on the planning mandates. Like, does the developer make some deal with the city government, or, you know, who runs it, who manages it? I think that's the bit.
Community infrastructure levy.
Exactly. Like, that's a bit that gets complicated, but that's also what I guess the public see or interacts the most with, than the 200 units. So all that to say is that there's like a large part, like Joseph said, the joy part of it, of the architecture design or urban design, the social and environmental consciousness of it, that is not quantified yet.
Yeah.
Or we haven't figured out a best way to sort of, you know, we want to do these because we know it's good for us, good for the city, for the public, because we're taught that way. But the reality is, like, if we don't put a financial or operational principle to this, it's likely that, you know, even though we provide good designs, may not turn out to be what we intend to be. So again, it goes back to who's paying. Like, can the public-private development be more efficient in many ways? The American government or American city governments has put a lot of, you know, fundings or infrastructure repair money in many brackets, and how do we sort of efficiently utilize those here and now with developers? I think could be an interesting way to maneuver things.
Yeah, and I also, what you said just reminded, it's just, I want to say some things out there, put some things out there, might sound a bit out there, but it's okay. But right about what you said about, again, Joseph and you, architecture bringing us joy, and then designing a certain urban space. I feel maybe we don't get paid enough because creative fields are risky fields, because it's something that is so subjective that it could go wrong easily. For example, for a surgeon's job, I would, of course, it's very complicated, but at the end of the day, there's a set of rules, and if you follow the set of rules, you come to a good or bad conclusion. Same with coding, same with accounting, same with so many professions except the creative fields. And because there's so much risk involved, it's just something that we all feel like, just as the world as a whole, feel a bit more weird about investing money in, feeling attaching money to it. And then Joseph and I were also talking about like kind of the out of sight, out of mind thing, because with creative professions, maybe you don't see their worth because it's not as obvious. Maybe in a city like New York it is, because honestly, every corner you turn, you see something. But coming from Pakistan and Lahore, it's not something that I would see, whereas I would see people doing other jobs that maybe were obviously more valuable. And weirdly, I want to connect the two. At the end of the day, creativity is kind of nourishment for the brain, right? Um, it's for the soul, really. And it's the effect of it is also something that's not very obvious. Like, I'm trying to connect a lot of things going on in my brain here.
It's okay. We see the cogs turning. You're like, and this connects to that. What was I trying to say? Yeah, go ahead.
But it's just, that's not something you can see, that it, what it brings for your soul. And I think that's what COVID kind of changed a little bit, is that when you were stuck in your homes and you had nothing else to do, you did turn to the creative industry to just bring nourishment to your soul. And I know that at the end of the day, that did not bring any financial spike or betterment for us, but I think it did increase some amount of appreciation that we hold for that. And I mean, at the end of the day, I don't know, we all don't know how to bridge this gap, this money issue, but I think we can start with appreciating our creativity a bit more.
Mm.
When you said risk, I was thinking about, there's the risk to the project, the risk of design changing, but there's also like the risk in like liability, and the fact that we are all doing things that leave us open. When we're designing, we are doing things that open us to law. Like everyone makes mistakes, and if we don't do our due diligence, we are susceptible to being sued and being personally liable to massive financial or even legal penalties, imprisonment. And I think the amount of risk is often not appreciated when architects do their fees. In the UK, there's a massive push, like with the Building Safety Act. Architects have always been responsible for building regs compliance, but they're essentially making the rules are slightly shifting so that there isn't a approved inspector or someone who's kind of like consulting on these things. It's trying to put more a liability on the individual architect. So there needs to be kind of a compensation in the fees for taking this risk. But I've seen, and I think it was interesting what Eamon was saying earlier about looking at tech industries for different sort of routes into for different business models. And I think there is sort of some architects are trying to find ways to improve the business model by cutting out some of the risk, and risk is value in a way. So things like I want to say metaverse architecture is a good example, because you're doing the job of an architect, you're using creativity to create anything you want, but actually you don't have to follow building regs. So you're actually taking a lot less risk while potentially taking the same fee. Equally with sort of companies that's actually, I mean, that's probably the best example. Stick with the metaverse one. But it's just an example of like trying to cut the risk out, then it's less financial risk as well.
Yeah.
Or like you said, give a fee to it. What if you
charge
finish
more.
building it, and then for the next 90 years, you get paid every year because your building survived or did a good job.
That's a great idea, I think.
I think it's all about all the tech.
Get royalties for your building.
Exactly. It's like a
Yeah.
subscription. Think about it. The tech
Yeah.
business model is that once you have a software, which is the equivalent of a building, and then it's up and running, and then the user pay every year or certain amount of time, and it just keeps going. It keeps going, and then that motivates.
And it would also
you to put more
incentivize
stuff
us
to
for
it.
buildings that last.
Yeah.
And perform,
that down,
like
guys.
live up to their performance requirements, green or eco-friendly. They don't consume too much energy. That would incentivize architects to design better buildings.
Exactly, and incentivize
model.
the repair of it. Now that we see all the light tech housing going disrepair in like 30 years, like because there's no constant investment back to it. Not like the Uber app where they have a million people, that's too much, 1,000 people maintaining it every month.
That's very cool. It's like, oh, that bridge didn't fall. Give me money. It survived another year. Give me money.
Exactly.
I like that. We should copyright this idea. Copyrighted by Arcuspace.
I think even in the binary of how we work sometimes too, like between the architect and the engineer, there's always supposed to be this age-old debate that goes back to the beginning of time or something. Like the engineer, the architect to never meet up or whatever. I remember I was watching this thing on Instagram once where there was a debate in the comments, and I just like to read the comments because I like to see what people have to say about architecture and things like that. And they were talking about, someone was like, so what's the difference between architecture and engineer? And someone was like, oh, the engineer like does things that are functional and practical, and then the architect does like the pretty stuff. And then it had like so many likes. I was so mad. So I had to write something, but I was like, who cares?
Stop reading Reddit.
And I think something that's really cool that I learned in school one time, there was an architect that we was invited to give a lecture, and they're talking that beauty is a function. Like the idea that beauty is part of how something should work, right? It's not a tertiary or secondary thing. It is just as important as, having all these other things, having the actual amenity. And he went pretty far with his stance on it. And he was, I'm not sure if I fully agree with how he might have worded it or things like that, but I think the essence of what he's trying to say is that also beauty is a right, is how he put it. And it is something that we should try to put into society. You should try to put beautiful things into society. And I think the definition of what beauty means can maybe then become the thing that's a bit more subjective, but I do think that that sort of mentality was very interesting to me, right? Because I think even in school, sometimes there was this idea about functionality versus aesthetic. And this idea that the aesthetic of something becomes its functionality, right? The idea that something looking that way is its function was very interesting to me. And it really did change my perspective on what I think architecture is meant to do. I still do personally believe architecture should serve people first, but I do think that the beauty of the architecture itself also should have equal credence as well. That's why I have so many problems with how like most of the built environment is, right? It's very much focused on like money and things. And then how the building actually looks is fine as far as it has the right square footage and it works and it stands and it survives. It's like, you know, it's, yeah, I really hope that that becomes part of the conversation if we're going to actually think about how we get paid as well.
But the
I
developer
agree.
probably won't pay you for that bit, so you have to do that bit for free.
Good grief.
But I agree with you, Joseph, especially with like cultural buildings. An opera house, you know, apart from the acoustics or a concert hall, it does something to your soul, which is different from listening to that artist on an empty plot on the street.
Yeah, sure.
Like in addition to amplifying all the sounds and acoustic performance, the building does something to you if you're sitting on the upper circle or if you're sitting in the lodge or if you're standing up and looking at the ceiling. There is that beauty function, nourishing your soul.
Yeah, I agree. I think as human beings, we just look for beauty. It just brings us peace. As shallow as that sounds, it's true.
Yeah. I think we should get to closer to the end of the conversation.
Yes.
But here's the question that I really want to ask before we do that. Maybe it could be the last question. Is like, how do you guys feel right now in your current situation? If you're not in work right now, your job you're going in, like, how do you feel in terms of the work you do right now and how much you're getting paid? And you don't have to say the number because like I get that this becomes a really big thing in architecture offices or things like that. It's like don't mention it. Don't ask me how much I make. But yeah, like, and I guess I'll start. Like personally, right now, for me, given that this is my very first job in the fields, and when I was in school, I didn't do that many internships because I was working summer jobs and things like that. Right now, like I very much prioritized the job over the money. Like, of course, I knew like how much I should probably ask for to survive in my situation, looking at rent and things like that. But honestly, I was probably willing to take that job for very little money if it came down to it, just because I really wanted to do that job. I wanted that to become the kickstart for how I'm going to pursue my career and education and things like that. And I don't regret that at all. But now I'm like, okay, I'm going to go to grad school. And then after grad school, I'm like, okay, do I want to go back to that mentality or not? And in a weird way, even though, yeah, our firm maybe doesn't make the most money, I don't get paid the most. Like there are moments where everything feels worth it all of a sudden. Like you have like one good conversation with a client and you're like, yeah, this is it. This is what I want to do. And I've had those moments so many times at work that like it doesn't really ever make me question anything in terms of like, oh, I should get paid more or whatever. It just feels so fulfilling for me. And I guess for me, that's where my value's at right now. But I also know for myself that in the future, I do need to start prioritizing the financial aspect of my livelihood, right? Because if you're going to support yourself and your family and things like that, that will become a factor whether I like it or not. So yeah, I think that's like the thing I'm grappling with right now in terms of like what my next move is. I'm not sure where everybody's at with that.
Does someone else want to go first?
I could go first. I agree with you, Joseph, because like I did work on a job and other internships before that where I was thinking I was being underpaid. But like you did, I was seeing it more as an intellectual investment to myself. But I think there is a time limit and a financial limit to as to how long you can go thinking you're investing intellectually on yourself. Maybe it's a 20s thing. And when we hit 30s, we realize, okay, if I want to have a family, if I want to support other people, and if I want to pay rent and maybe get a mortgage or car, like other expenses, then the underpayment hits harder. So now I'm in a position, and like once I graduate next week, in a couple of weeks time, I think thanks to my family, I do have the luxury to break even every month, but I know it's not a sustainable thing to do in the long run. So in a couple years time, I do think I need to, like for a couple years, I can work in a firm where I learn a lot, but I don't get as paid as much. But that experience I can turn into value later for myself if I set up my own business, or if I go into real estate, or I don't know.
Real estate.
That's
No shade, no shade.
yeah, that's how I see things at the moment.
That's such a subjective question.
Sorry.
But it's so right. Like it's the moments that make you feel like it's all worth it that we live for, like crumbs, literally. So I'm working at a big firm, and big firms do pay considerably well compared to other size firms. But at the end of the day, it also boils down to your personal circumstances, right? That's why I said it's such a subjective question. Like I know that if I weren't supporting my family, this income would be something I'm okay with and I could live a comfortable life in. But because I have to support other people, it still feels like I'm trying hard to meet edges. And I don't know how to move forward in this situation. Maybe we just climb the corporate ladder, but then there's also like at what cost, right? Because there's many times when I question if it's really nourishing the soul. And I'm sorry for bringing that phrase up because we've used it a lot, but there's I feel like I'm kind of in the opposite situation than what Banu was talking about. Like, you can work, like, is this an intellectually nourishing experience? And then you kind of start to the real side of things. I feel like I've started to the real side of things first, where my intellect wants to be nourished. Not that I'm not learning things every day, but I know it could be so much better, or I could have so many more of those wow moments. So I'm kind of in the middle of that debate right now. And right now, I feel like my value is attached to money, although I know that that's not who I want to be as a person.
Yeah. And quickly, I don't think this is necessarily to villainize anybody that does care about money. I'm like, I think a lot of our friends have this conversation where it's like, so I think for some people, a job is just a job, and that's fine, right? Like your job is the thing that you make money with, and it supports the things you do outside of work. I think that's perfectly fine. Like it just, again, depends on the person and what your things lie in. I think just generally people who tend to go into creative fields tend to have that opposite attachment value. So that's kind of where that's coming from. I just wanted to put that out there so we're not bashing anybody necessarily.
With the idea of like climbing the corporate ladder, the reason like that really doesn't appeal is that to me it really has like, you can't just keep climbing. It has an upper limit.
Yeah.
And Ravi, if you're saying like you need to do this to support dependencies, and your life costs will never they'll probably never go down. You'll probably but there is like a point where you reach associate director. I mean, and unless you're able to like make the jump up to partner, you there's kind of like a limit on how much you can climb. And then also like to the enjoyment of your job point, you're like, and maybe I'm feeling this a little more now because I'm in this position where I've been working as an architect for 5 years, and I love doing the activities that an architect does in drawing and designing. But now actually a significant, and particularly in the last few months, I send a lot of emails, and I do a lot of project managing.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun.
And I was speaking to, I guess, my direct senior, who's an associate director, and he was kind of questioning. He just sends emails. He doesn't do anything but send emails. why didn't he make the jump to being a project manager when he was like my age or our age? He would be doing the same activity. He'd be earning 20K more than he does now. And there isn't the same like feeling that you're not doing the job that you signed up for, because you've at least made that tangible jump. And we chuckled on I don't know, real estate as another sort of industry that I think architects jump into. And it's something that's kind of available because of the skills sort of, well, we have this sort of mindset and the industry knowledge. But yeah, there feels like there's an inevitability with climbing the corporate ladder that you'll end up not doing what you wanted to be doing anyway, and also not making the money that you should be making for the commitment that you're giving.
Well, thank you for the advice, Jack.
Yeah, thank you.
Well
I don't want to
taken.
put you off.
Project
I've decided, my personal situation is I'm not going to jump into project management because I do enjoy the job of an architect too much. And I think that I've worked at 4 companies now, and yeah, we're definitely not paid adequately, a lot of them. But every time you change jobs, that's your best bargaining. That's your opportunity to get a pay rise. And because from moving around quite a lot, I think that's given me more control of my wage. And I think people, as they progress through their careers, become better and better at negotiating for pay. And people should be more transparent and open to like discussing with their colleagues what their pay is, joining union, sort of, yeah. We have got negotiating power, and we should negotiate for our value and appreciate our own value. But what I think I want is financial control, and I don't think I can get there without sort of probably ultimately without starting a firm for myself and doing the job by yourself. That's how you have financial independence.
Very true.
Mm-hmm.
Iman?
Every time I think about money, my heart sank. Because like, I'm sure everyone here is very well equipped to go into pursue like economics or finance in college, in uni. And
Yeah,
then,
we're pretty smart.
yeah, we're pretty smart. We're pretty smart. Like because
I'm wearing
we're
glasses, and so are
pretty
you.
smart.
Of course you're smart.
So like if you all the time, like you think of like 7-10 years ago, you're like, why didn't I? But then I think it goes back to what Joseph was saying, like, like we think of career as our hobby, which is somewhat dangerous. But like, I was thinking about it yesterday. I was like, should I go for this talk or should I, go play tennis? Stuff like this.
You still playing tennis?
I try to.
Awesome, yay. Okay, we can play some tennis. Sorry, continue.
I think that there's like honor and joy we take in from when we work. That's why maybe we're okay to sort of let the intellectual nourishment take over certain financial nourishment, let's say. But yeah, in the end, it sounds like it's true that the corporate ladder leads you to whatever you don't want to do as an architect and designer. So yeah, I haven't figured this out yet. I think time will tell. I'm still very hopeful, even though my heart sinks. I'm still very hopeful in that there are things that we do to provide value, even though not necessarily monetary wise. I think I enjoy that aspect of our job as well. So we'd love to make more money.
Yes.
But let's see how it works.
That's actually really beautiful. Like, even if we're messed up in our own heads about things we attach value to, we as designers bring value to the world. And I think that's beautiful. Oh, Iman, you say such wonderful things. I'm like, oh, okay.
Butter up.
Okay, this is a very long episode. Like, maybe we can continue this conversation forever, but I just wanted to ask a concluding question, and I'm gonna ask everyone to keep it real short because we are
time right now.
Like, ugh. So our concluding question is always, what do you want our really, really wonderful viewers who are gonna leave us a lot of likes and subscribes to take away from this conversation? And I'm I'm just gonna start with something which is really dumb off the top of my head, the risk thing that we were talking about. I think at the end of the day, risk is design. You can't design without taking risk. And so we just need to continue to do that and try.
Ooh, something's wrong with your mic.
Robbie, your audio just went.
It's saying
sh-
Is this okay now?
yes.
it's
We can
back.
hear you.
Okay, great. What part did I cut off at?
Risk
Final words,
something.
final couple words.
Okay, well, yes, and one, don't be afraid to take risks because at the end of the day, risk is part of design and you can't design without risk. And just value ourselves more as creative professionals who bring a lot to the table. And I know that's really hard to do, but let's try.
Yeah. And I guess I'll go next then. I think for me, this is something that's hard to comment on because I'm really clearly still figuring it out in my own head. But I guess the main takeaway is I think it's good to not be too controlled by the finances of things. I think sometimes we need to trust ourselves a little bit. And again, it's a scary thing to do, and risk is something that everybody has to measure for themselves. But I think in doing so, we just need to sometimes demand what we think we should be making. Right? Like I think it's unfair that this binary that I do the thing I like or I make money. And I think there should be more of a conversation of like, if the thing you like is valuable, which if we can make the argument for it, it should just then garner the money. You shouldn't have to be making these decisions in the first place. I'm not sure how that works out because again, I'm trying to figure this out for myself. But I think kind of like what Jack was saying, like a lot of times I end up at this place. I'm like, maybe I need to start my own firm, but I'm like, I don't really want to do that right away or right now, if at all, right? But it feels like all these options end up becoming opposing units, right? It's either I follow the money or I follow the pursuit of my intellectual soul searching or whatever, right? Yeah, I guess the thing is to maybe demand more if in whatever way we can. And I know that's scary to do, but I'm also trying to muster up my bravery in that way as well.
Yeah, I'm following on from that. My advice is just to like negotiate your worth. If anything, it reflects well on you.
I can go next. This is an advice for myself as well, the way Joseph did. So, not that I'm an expert on it, but among peers or classmates or colleagues, it's always useful to be transparent about each other's salaries. I don't think it benefits employees to talk. If you're silent about it, it benefits the employer. So being more transparent about it, being more transparent about unpaid overtime hours, instead of trying to romanticize it. I think the more transparent we are among ourselves, the more negotiating power we have. Note to self as well as the audience.
That's great. I love that.
It's a great no. Everyone says so many great things. I think one thing another note to self is, and for everyone who's trying to start a new business, I think we also need a new business model that sort of enlarges designers' capacity to negotiate. What would that be? Making it a more designer manager kind of style where you sort of you get consistent pay through a project that you do, or having a bigger share or bigger say in the whole project, as a whole, as an industry as a whole, is something that I look very much forward to because I believe there's new market happening, given the new stuff, the environment, climate crisis, the kind of the financial liabilities, everything. I believe there's new market that we can tap into and then develop new ways of thinking and working around things. But yeah, that's
Great.
BBD.
Right?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Before we leave, I did want to say that our professor at Cornell, Erin, said this thing that your starting salary should not be less than what you pay for your first year of college. And I think maybe that's a good place to start.
No one can afford that.
Well, yeah, but
But I get the point. So I'm just
yeah. And well, thank you all for having this conversation. Banu, thank you for bringing up the word transparency, which I don't know how we didn't get to in this hour-long conversation
Yes,
about
transparency
money.
definitely.
I am really mad.
No. We had to blow off some steam. 1 hour of whining for the
And
fruit
Good grief.
to collect the fruits later. So
remember the
maybe
violin.
Oh,
We're playing.
good grief.
Well, thank you everyone for tuning in. Thank you to our wonderful guests. Please like, subscribe, show some love, and you know what? Send that risky text. Live a little. Bye.
Thank you guys. See you next time.